Previously, we have covered the history of the Maxim machine gun, and today we'll talk about another Maxim system gun, one that took a radical departure in design and became a darling of the Great War. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is absolutely nothing. I'm sorry guys, but I don't have it in show today. That means we must be dealing with a machine gun that we filmed elsewhere, and in this case, is the gun Machine Mark I Vickers 303 inch. So we are going to rely heavily on the light box. Coming in at 44 inches in length and weighing just 29 pounds, this is a dang light, full-size sustained fire machine gun for World War I. In this configuration, it chambers the 303 British cartridge, feeding from a 250-round belt. These guns were set up with the Mark IV British tripod, not Vickers' first choice, but it's what the Army wanted. For those of you new to the show, yeah, I normally have the firearm with me, but sometimes we have to travel and borrow, and we can't always do all the research or film ahead of time, so here we are. We're going to rely on some extra video and images to get this done. But let's go on back to the beginning where we don't need the gun yet at all. The history of the Vickers gun is actually, well, it locks into a story we've already told, the history of the Maxim. From earlier episodes, you should recognize Hiram Stevens Maxim. Born near Sangerville, Maine in 1840, I will leave off the details and just say he combined a myriad of patents and moving parts into this, the Maxim gun, a self-powered automatic firearm, the first true and successful machine gun the world had known. In 1884, he would found a company along with Albert Vickers and a few other businessmen. This would prove key to our story today. You see, Albert and his brother Tom headed an old family steelworks known as Vickers Sons and Company Limited. This dates back to 1829 when Edward Vickers became involved in his wife's family business. She was part of the Naylor and Sanderson Iron and Steel Company of Sheffield, and following some internal strife, the firm broke up, a splinter of which, well, that became Naylor, Hutchinson, Vickers and Company. Now, Hutchinson dropped out of the business in 1841, and over the next 2 decades, they managed to expand without him just fine. In 1867, Naylor died without heirs, and so the Vickers family alone carried on the work, with Tom and Albert now at the helm. So Albert Vickers takes a very active role in Maxim's new gun company, and he has a good reason, because he has a vision. The Vickers company has been producing ships for the British Navy, and has gotten into fitting them out as well. You know, sell as much as you can to one person. And it has made the brothers consider, we can be like a one-stop shop for an entire warship. Steel, ship armor, and arms all in one big sale, no outsourcing. So to really sell the armaments part, he would absorb Maxim, and he would retitle Vickers & Son to Vickers Sons and Maxims Limited in 1897. And that was actually a success. Whole Navy ships were being prepared by the Vickers family business, and the pay was quite good without having to contract out to anyone else. Of course, if you really want to keep the cash flowing, you have to make your own everything, and that includes holding on to all the patent rights. You don't want to pay out licenses to other people. Luckily, Vickers Maxim held the premier machine gun, and it was a very effective weapon. Now, the British would adopt the gun in .45 caliber and later adapted it down to .303. This was a heavy affair, almost field artillery, very big gun and carriage. Germany would also take interest in the Maxim machine gun, and so starting in 1894, Ludwig Lowe, well, they would begin producing a clone under license. This negotiation actually began back in 1902 and included a 7-year leash agreement. This has meant that Lowe could only produce for Germany. By the way, Lowe would change the name to DWM, don't get confused. They could only produce for Germany, and they had to get permission if they wanted to sell to anybody else. This meant that they could kind of be auxiliary production if there was an emergency for Vickers, but that never really came to pass. When the agreement wrapped in 1899, they repackaged the same British Mark I pattern and sold it internationally. Now, Vickers Maxim did get a royalty on each gun produced, even after, the lease agreement, but they rather get all the money for making the entire gun. So it was time for them to update their design to compete with the Germans. Hiram Maxim had actually wandered off by this point. While he was still part of the company, he was not taking very much of an active role in development. And that's mostly because they had to kind of shoo him away, push him out, because he was tinkering too much at the run-up to the Mark I adoption. He kept making last-minute changes and improvements, and that would start the process all over again, and they just wanted to get that money in. Instead, naval gunnery specialist Arthur Trevor Dawson is credited for leading the team, which would make all further updates to the Maxim. Most patents will bear his name, especially as he became managing director in 1906, taking over just about everything except for the actual steel production. Now, it appears most of the actual design work, though, well, that came from one George Thomas Buckham. Formerly an ordnance engineer at W.G. Armstrong, Whitworth and Company, he joined Vickers, Sons and Maxim in 1895. His work likely began with the commercial model 1901, an attempt to simplify and lighten the military machine gun. It also included a headspace adjustable lock capable of being easily disassembled in the field. The 1901 pattern is the sort of gun you see adopted in the USA, Italy, and Portugal. Now, that pattern did all right, but it was not enough to float the entire Vickers boat, or at least this division. In 1904, the British stopped taking in the original 1889 Mark I, and they had as many as they could really want for now. And DWM, well, they just kept making sales abroad, beating Vickers with their own product, even though it wasn't as improved. They even got the attention of the Russians, which really kind of aggravated Vickers. The Russians would develop the model 1905 off that original 1899, combined with the Vickers Maxim 1901's simplified S-shaped cocking handle and adjustable headspace lock. At this point, Vickers has had it. They were going to prove that they had the best Maxim design, and that resulted in the model 1906 New Light, which used higher quality, thinner steel plus aluminum alloy parts, such as the feed block, which was actually physically large like the older model, but it was lightened due to the material. The jacket was corrugated, so it could be thinner but still strong, and allowed for greater surface area for cooling. Even the booster was skeletonized, although this was more to allow it to run cleaner than it is for weight. Total weight of the gun fell down to 40.5 pounds. For comparison, the Mark I's were 58.4 pounds. Now, sadly for Vickers Maxim, this was not a successful sales model. They just could not get it to move out the door. No one was buying. Moreover, the Germans had adapted the 1901 pattern and were lightening it with the help of Spandau. As we know, this would go on to become the MG08 and later the commercial MG09. Now, neither of these guns were available just yet, but the former was really taking shape over various trials, particularly in Switzerland, where Vickers could see it. So they wisely saw the writing on the wall. DWM was taking the market with their own inventions, and soon the royalties would stop as the design actually did enter the public domain. So what they needed at this point was an improved Maxim, a whole new invention though, something that could be patented and protected. That way they get the cash. And yet, it needed to be demonstrably better than the current products available so that they could actually sell it. It needed to be way better because just being a little bit better wasn't enough. So Dawson and Buckham got to work, and their goal was to make the lightest, most portable possible Maxim with no loss of performance. Now, this focused on the smallest, lightest parts had gotten them as far as the 1906, so something more dramatic had to happen. And it looks like Buckham was the one that figured this out, the key to the whole process, which was that he just took that lock and flipped it upside down in order to prevent the wasted internal space. The toggle now breaks in an upward position, and this was enough to warrant a new patent filed in 1907 and accepted in 1908. A key point, the trigger bar must now run across the top of the receiver. Overall, the light pattern 1908 used the adjustable lock of the 1901, a US-style 1904 muzzle booster, although this one you're seeing now is a bit later model, and a model 1906 corrugated steel water jacket. The new layout would not play ball with the old rear sight, so that was out, and this tangent-mounted, much further forward positioned one was in. Now, in compressing the scale of the gun, the receiver actually gained strength. If you can shave 4 inches off a plate of steel, then you can make it thinner and keep the same rigidity. They further reduced weight on the feed block and the cocking handle. This means the light pattern 1908 got down to just 28 pounds. That is a huge savings. If you recall, again, the 1889 Mark I, roughly 58 pounds. The light in 1906, 40.5 pounds, and the German MG08 had squeezed in at just 40 pounds. So yeah, over 25% lighter than the nearest competitor. We are really talking about a good improvement here. Now, the whole lock was overhauled, and minor details like the feed pawl's method of attachment were also, considered, improved, and patented. So what did this accomplish? Well, Vickers now has a new and frankly superior firearm, which they and they alone can produce and sell for the near future. So that means it's time to go out there and market the thing. They started shipping samples in 1909, and a trickle of small orders would come on in. Japan would start things off, but Canada, Greece, El Salvador, Turkey, Germany, Spain, and the US of A would all purchase handfuls of these guns. Actually, our images of the early model are from a US sample. Anyway, some recognition and sales is nice, but a big order is what Vickers really wanted. And most of all, they wanted it at home with the British Army or Navy. So, they would get their first chance in the summer of 1910 with a demonstration at the School of Musketry, Hythe. Now, this display prompted the Small Arms Committee to trial the gun properly and right away. Their results were ready by September, and they found the gun frankly amazing. But, being that this was a military trial, of course they had some complaints. The corrugated jacket seemed a bit thin, didn't it? And does corrugation really even work? We're nervous about this thing. They worried about the ejector tube set up for the gun and feared that it would foul the tripod's elevating gears. And in honesty, they did not like the tripod very much either, which was a new design based off the old 1906. This gun was also shown with a new steam condenser and pump setup that they did not care for either. This was abandoned. Even so, these were minor points, so 26 guns were ordered and paid for extended trials. Of course, they noted the usual malfunctions, but also paid attention to consumption of oil, loss of water, the overall heat of the gun, and the ease of sighting accurately. So how fast can I get on this thing and see what I'm doing? The new Vickers gun was compared to the old Maxim 1889 as a control, and both were subjected to forced failures, rust and sand, uneven ground, and the time required to replace commonly broken parts. So they basically like, that thing broke, just go fix it real quick, and they'd time it out. The results, well, they were consolidated in the summer of 1912. In nearly all categories, the new lightened Vickers defeated the existing Maxim. It was lighter, it was just as reliable, just as accurate, easier to clear when jammed, and easier to strip in order to replace parts. But they had to hate something, right? Well, the sight radius was just plain worse, and they were concerned about the new wide-open underside of the action that resolved the old ejection tube. That bit was solved even before the trial was over, though, with a simple patented sliding cover, no more mud, even more tightened down than the original Maxim at this point because you could just seal it up for transport. Officials also thought the lock was harder to remove. It really doesn't seem like it was, but they thought so. And they did not like that the hand crank direction was now inverted. So because we flipped the action, we had to change you'll see it in the video. They thought it would confuse troops, which I sort of understand, but the engineering to fix this would have been insane compared to just knowing that you crank it the other way. It seems to me fairly automatic. If it doesn't want to go one way, you just push it the other. The rear sight, however, yeah, that's a problem. No one wants to look down half the gun, and adjusting it also meant reaching way forward compared to the old one. Lots of fiddling and squinting here. So they came up with this, a rear aperture with a pop-up ladder, albeit a single rod, that was much friendlier to use than more like the old British Mark I. While all this was happening, another country was also reviewing the new Vickers gun. They were first to adopt the 1889 Maxim and eager to take in the improved 1901. Italy was also fairly excited about the Vickers, and we kind of take for granted how much their early support for the Maxim-styled guns has really helped. After trialing in 1911, they ordered 890 for the troops, which shipped from May 1912 to July 1914, again ahead of British final adoption. As you can see, they kept that tangent rear sight. By the way, in 1911, Hiram Maxim would retire from the company, and his name would be dropped, making it just Vickers Limited. Back in Britain, they were actually already experimenting with one of the best possible uses for this gun. They were strapping it to airplanes. This would come in handy later, but the new and improved Vickers gun, of course, was far superior to the 1889 Anywhere, land, air, sea, and it would be adopted, entering the list of changes in November of 1912. Now known as the Gun Machine Mark I Vickers 303-inch. Huzzah! Now, while I do not have the gun here, I did record some previous footage, so let's take a look. First up here is that ladder style rear sight. Yes, it's a single pull, but it's the same 90-degree adjustment as a ladder sight. Turn knob, pick position, and tighten. It also features a folded down rear battle sight that is an aperture. Turning to the lock again, this is a pull back and release setup. Now we move down to that corrugated water jacket and start our disassembly at the muzzle booster. In this case, we begin by pulling the pin and rotating 30 degrees or so, just so that we can pull the cap off. Inside we can unscrew our cone. Earlier models were a sort of pinch setup. And then we can remove the base. By the way, that fouling is because this gun was range fresh when we filmed this bit. Now with all that off, we can saddle back and throw the lever to open up the feed block cover, allowing us to lift out the feed block itself. This works just like the old Maxim, grabbing the next round in the belt and pulling it inward. All powered by an arm that meets up with an extension off the recoiling breech assembly. Now let's move on to the fusil. Press it off, unhook the spring, and tuck it away. I'm going to pull this cross pin a bit early, and then open the action cover. Whack that handle back, and lift, and twist the lock out. Again, this is a compressed version of the Maxim lock, but with the sear up top. That's because this is the trigger bar running across the overhead cover. Now after firing, the action is recocked by this armature as it folds up rearward. Returning that earlier pin, it held the trigger group in place. That's the bit with our safety and trigger paddles as mimed here. With it down, I can remove the crank handle stop and a matching plate that carries a fusil stud. Now the action can be removed from the rear, including the barrel. Here we have our toggle, and yeah, those extensions come off real easy. Let me set this down. Okay, here's the toggle that does all the locking. When straight, locked. When bent, unlocked. Alright, so I got all that apart back in the day, but I have to wonder, how did I do for time? Luckily, we actually found some old war footage of a demonstration of exactly this process. So let's take a quick look. Okay, maybe I could use some practice, but we do have something that that gentleman did not. We have an animation from VBB SMYT so that you can understand exactly how this gun works. Let's take a look. Starting off with the basics, yes, this is a water-cooled gun using a jacket filled with H2O. As the barrel heats, the water boils, holding a constant temperature. Wasting nothing, that steam is collected in a condenser can, which can be used later to refill the jacket. Turning to the action, this is just about the same as the previous Maxim. Once we fire a round, the barrel and lock recoil together a short distance. The lower extension on the crank arm engages an external roller, causing the crank to turn upwards. Internally, this raises the knee joint of the action. This allows the lock to head rearward on its own as the barrel stops. Ammunition is controlled by a vertical plate at the front of the lock. This is known as the extractor and has lugs on either side to engage the inside receiver wall, which guides it down during recoil, and under spring tension it pops back up after chambering. In the Vickers, the trigger bar is set over the top of the action, engaging the sear at the top of the lock. If we release the trigger, we'll see that the overhead transfer bar no longer presses on our sear. That halts the gun. If we push again, the sear tips. Looking closer still, we can see the firing pin in red is being pressed forward by a brown flat spring. The blue tumbler, however, keeps it held rearward, along with that pink safety sear. As the lock closes on a new round, the lever at the rear of the lock lowers and disconnects that pink safety sear. If we push the trigger, the green sear, again the lock trigger, releases the tumbler, which in turn frees the firing pin. Now from this angle we can see the fusee spring, which pulls the knee of the action back down into lock. While here we can look at the ammunition feed as well. Recoil moves not only the lock, but also a set of side plates. The left-hand plate has an extension, which pulls and pushes an arm attached to the feed block. This drags a set of spring-loaded fingers over the incoming belt and then pulls the next cartridge in line to be picked up. See, this thing is as simple as can be, and now you understand it completely. So let's get over to Mae for a demonstration.
Using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians the fire? Oh, it's a lovely war. Lovely war to be a soldier. Take the pay as soon as we never get up to the sun. The breakfast up the with eggs and ham, when we got plum and apple jam. Home for us, rake Any complaints this morning? Do we complain? Not we. What's the matter with lumps of onion floating?
I like doing machine gun episodes, even though they take a lot of extra work, and I'm glad you guys seem to enjoy them too. Alright, so the British have the Vickers Mark I, and being that it's among the lightest and most advanced guns of the era, I bet they order a metric butt ton of these things. Yeah, we kind of talked about this in our last Maxim 1910 episode. You see, the British had a particular focus on cavalry, which they felt were the elites of the battlefield, and properly used, they would be the deciding factor in outmaneuvering other European armies in a large-scale conflict. Now, following the cavalry was a strong focus on individual musketry. The professional British soldier was likely the most proficient average marksman of the early war, thanks to their volunteer army. And that helped, don't get me wrong, but it's no match for a machine gun. I mean, you saw Mae on the range, that thing's terrifying. And some British servicemen knew this long before the war, particularly Ian Hamilton. Now, this was a British Indian Army military attaché to Japan who would pay close attention during the Russo-Japanese War and noted their effective use of the machine gun was devastating. He particularly remarked that cavalry was essentially worthless against an entrenched machine gun team. Sadly, his warnings were not heeded at home, and Britain did not stock up on the new wonder weapon. By August 6th of 1914, the Army had just 109 Vickers guns. Okay, well, generally navies tend to be more, forward-thinking. How many did they have? 2. Oh boy. Now, they did have some old 1889s still on hand, and they were running fine, but when we look at the machine gun totals for the war, we can see Russia, who faced MGs in their war with Japan, and Germany, who paid close attention to that same outcome, had loaded up. France has a modest sum as well. Britain, however, now this is right at the beginning of the conflict, I remind you, they were sorely behind. Without getting into tactics just yet, I think it's safe to sort of say in hindsight, having a fair few machine guns and well-trained men to run them, that would be pretty critical when war were declared. Oh boy, and suddenly the War Office is scrambling for Vickers guns. Well, sort of. You see, the Secretary of War was not too understanding when it came to resource management. He just could not fathom why the Ministry of Munitions was demanding a 9-month projection of expected needs for rifles and machine guns. His response was to just demand as much of both as he could get. In those early days, however, well, that's not always possible. They kind of take up the same resources, and they were suddenly overloaded with an ever-growing conflict. Munitions knew that you could get however many extra rifles out of the men and steel and time it would take to produce a single machine gun. So they're trying to decide where they're going to set up manufacture, But still, there was a push to expand the number of machine guns per battalion, and this pressure became stronger every day that they faced the very effective German use of the MG08. Their guns were being used in attack and defense, direct fire, and as light artillery, harassing critical movement points, and they seemed to be everywhere. Kitchener would begrudgingly push the standard for the British battalion up to 2 machine guns, with 4 as a maximum. Anything beyond that would be, of course, a luxury. Minister of Munitions Lloyd George, upon hearing this edict, would declare, take Kitchener's maximum and square it. Multiply that result by 2, and when you are in sight of that, double it again for good luck. This guy gets it. Between August of 1914 and June of 1915, 1,792 Vickers guns would be ordered. This was still in that argumentative phase where Britain hadn't quite decided what they were doing about the machine gun. In July of 1915, another contract would drop for 12,000, that's more like it, and provided financial assistance to help expand the Vickers plant. This had a factory in Erith. This was the big, more modern deal. The setup dates back to when they sort of worked with Nordenfelt when they rolled all that in a previous episode. And the Crayford shops, which were built on old textile mills, and they had been converted to produce machine guns in 1887. It took a lot to get both of these to producing the numbers that the British Army would actually need for the war. That 12,000 number was expected by August of 1916, with production reaching 634 guns a week. While Vickers aimed to meet their goal, there was no real hope. I mean, don't forget, they were already supplying ships, cannon, aircraft, and more. Vickers Limited was the backbone of the United Kingdom's armed forces, really, and they were being pulled in a lot of different directions at once. That made for steel being in very high demand, prices soared, skilled labor, well, that was a huge challenge. We see that all the time. And then when the draft first came into effect, they did not think to put in an exemption for munitions workers. That came later, so there was even some gutting right at that moment. So Vickers would look for help, and like so many others at the time, they turned to the US, and maybe not as wisely, they turned to Colt. They had already produced the Model 1904 Maxim, and while it was not currently in production, they should still not have a huge problem adapting to this new Vickers gun. This is Great War Colt we are talking about. At every turn so far, they have managed to make a mess out of tooling up production or doing anything in a hurry. Vickers ordered 6,000 from them in July of 1915. This created a huge pile of letters, drawings, measurements, etc. Lots and lots of sort of communication back and forth with Colt, trying to help them figure out how to make a gun to actual spec. By the time of delivery in 1916, they had not even tooled up for production, a complete waste of Vickers' time. But they poured on the gas anyway, and by October 1916, Vickers itself was wrapping things up just a few months late, which is when they got hit with another, well, 5,000 piece order. About this time, it was calculated that they would need to produce 800 guns a month just to keep up with wartime attrition. Not only that, but the war in the skies was expanding rapidly. More and more planes were going up, now armed with machine guns. The lightened Vickers, well, that was perfect, especially because it was compatible with the latest technology, the interrupter. See, early planes had to keep the MGs out of the path of the propeller or just shoot through it and hold on tight. Having it straight in line with the pilot was just too good for fighting, so you start to see some wild attempts at fixing the issue and diverting the rounds. Ultimately, however, we get the interrupter, a mechanism that keeps the gun from firing when the propeller crosses in front. Now, there are a few ways to do this, but the Vickers was amenable to several, making it the king of the air. Now, I would love to go into detail on this, by the way. I really want to talk about aviation machine guns with photos and drawings and animations and everything, but it's just not in the cards for today. Honestly, it's my hope to get time enough to handle both, like, this research and travel and all the things necessary to do, the aviation bit, and I'd like to also cover very specifically sniper rifle use as their own independent topics, since the concepts on both apply to multiple firearms instead of just one firearm. It's more of a general usage than it is a particular gun. Now, returning to our story, the British were not the only ones flying with these guns. France, Italy, Russia, and the US found the Vickers to be among the best aircraft machine guns, and we get a real escalation going now because we have all these ground machine guns, then we have aircraft machine guns flying overhead to strafe the ground, and then you have aircraft to shoot the other aircraft with machine guns, okay? And now that the aircraft are armed, they can harass artillery, so that means we have to put anti-aircraft machine guns on the ground towards the rear, pointed up at the sky. These are definitely important, by the way. As a matter of fact, the most likely cause of the Red Baron's demise was a Vickers gunner. At first credited to Captain Roy Brown, examination of Manfred von Richthofen's injuries pointed to ground fire. The man in the most likely position firing at the time was Sergeant Cedric Popkin, manning his Vickers, configured as an anti-aircraft gun. It's a big war, but sometimes names like these remind us of how personal it was for each and every one who fought. It's just neat that you can make a one-on-one human connection, because it was usually a one-on-one human connection for a lot of the guys. The stats just get in the way of seeing that. Anyway, as you can see, the Vickers was already in high demand, and then they went and slapped them on tanks. Yeah, so ground fighting, air fighting, shooting into the air, now on tanks, let alone those that we put on ships or armored cars. To make things simpler, the War Office simply offered to buy any and all Vickers Limited could crank out, and they were hoping to expand to 4,000 units a month. So let's put some numbers on this. By the end of the war, Vickers Limited would have 107,000 employees, 32,500 of which were actually women. And as far as just machine guns go, they produced 75,242, with that number roughly equal across both of the factory plants. Wartime production did result in several minor changes. At first, Vickers had milled the right-hand panel to reduce the weight of the overall gun and included a spring-loaded sort of check lever to save time and to make the gun stronger. That check lever was thickened way up and the spring abandoned. The plate was no longer milled out, although you often find milled plates with the updated lever. There would also be an elevation stop added to prevent the fusee block from being sort of pinched by the mount, and the muzzle cup started as a slip-on and, like we saw, later changed to the kind that was threaded and you pull off. Now, that was actually done because they didn't want hammering it on and off to end up with somebody accidentally striking the muzzle and ruining the crown. In order to do that, another change had to happen because that meant they had to thread the barrel to match the cup, so that was updated as well. That's where you get a Mark II barrel. Now, in 1918, an easier-to-produce smooth jacket was also adopted, and an armored muzzle attachment cone. These, along with the rest of the changes, could push the gun up to a weight as high as 33 pounds. That's off of the initial, 29-ish. Alright, so that's going to wrap up our British production, and I know what you were thinking. Didn't the US also adopt this gun? And you would be right. They did adopt it in 1915, chambered for .30-06, and definitely a part of the Great War. Unfortunately, that is a whole other giant and complicated story because of course it involves Colt. So let's cross our fingers and hope that we can borrow one someday and get to it. Just run another Vickers in a slightly different configuration. I'd love to do that. It would give us the room to talk about it. But for now, we can still talk a little bit about Colt because you see, they did finally start that 6,000 piece order, but Vickers wasn't interested anymore. So Russia stepped in and they even upped it to 16,000. That they actually bought 268 before the war meant that they already really knew how to use the gun and were fond of it. And so they could take as many as they could really get. 16,000 is a good number for Russia when they're almost bankrupt. Only 3,000, however, would be delivered by the time of the revolution. And as US production was given priority, this really limited their ability to crank them out. 1,200 did remain unshipped in the US. These would be reworked into 11mm, actually, using a variant of the French Gras cartridge turned into an incendiary bullet for balloon busting. More of these would be made directly, but again, that is a separate story. I'd love to get an example in my hands. Alright, so we covered the development, the adoption, and the low pre-war production, followed by crazy numbers as the war went on. But what about actual usage of the gun? How did the British go from so few machine gunners to so many? This is actually a very critical part of the story and why I wanted to save time to talk about this. They almost lost all control of their machine gun program right at the start of the war, because the British had placed such a low value on machine guns compared to, say, cavalry or marksmanship. And so the units suffered from low prioritization, and it turned into a bit of a dead end for the soldiers. If you were going to, try to be some officer, you really didn't go through the machine gun section, all right? Even so, some people rose to the occasion and mastered their weapons, but in the early days of World War I, the limited guns available, well, these stationary machine guns proved to be high-value targets for the enemy, and attrition was nearly 100%. I mean, these guys were shot at every possible occasion, and you end up with a lot of skills being lost, and there was no one to really replace these men. So in steps Christopher Darcy Baker Carr, a captain who had retired some 8 years prior to the war, and volunteered immediately at the start of hostilities. He wanted to be on the front lines, but the best he could do was serve as a driver in France. It was unusual to know how to drive a car back then. There he met General Capper, who was aware that there was a problem with his machine guns. Capper knew Baker Carr was a former musketry instructor and asked him to help train up some gunners. Now, Baker Carr was not a machine gun man, but he knew the simple request required a severe response. And within a day, he decided on a grand approach, something big. What he wanted was a school to train the entire British Army's machine guns, selecting for the sharpest mind and skilled hands. He took his proposition to a then colonel and very busy George Harper. Now, the distracted colonel told Baker Carr to just get on with it as you like, but don't bother me, I'm busy. feel like I understand how this man feels. And the chauffeur took these words and leveraged them again and again, recruiting the best he could. Appropriating facilities and supplies, he bluffed and borrowed and outright lied to get what he needed to produce what the British Army needed. But in time, a school would actually form. He kept teaching and kept the momentum, and it expanded. It's not a bad way to think about it. I mean, it's just one man's sheer determination yet again in this war, a big war. Now, he rapidly developed tactics and training programs and generally caught Britain back up to Germany, all while his school wasn't formally recognized until March of 1915. That's how long, when it was finally given real resources. Baker Carr changed the British approach to deployment of the machine guns as well, forming the Machine Gun Corps as a separate arm. Over the war, his school would train 170,500 men, of which 62,000 would perish, very high casualty rate, again due to the attention that machine guns tend to attract on the battlefield. Baker Carr would rise to brigadier general, having saved the Empire's MG teams from utter devastation. He went on to form the heavy branch of the Machine Gun Corps, which was actually a front for the development of the tank. I'm really underselling this story, by the way. This is in the interest of time, so definitely check out Goldsmith's excellent book, The Grand Old Lady of No Man's Land, if you'd like to know way, way, way more about the Vickers gun. So now we have British soldiers capable of standing toe-to-toe with the German machine gunners. But how did they feel about their guns? Well, in truth, the Vickers is one of the most advanced and reliable designs of the war, and they were absolutely adored by the soldiers who wielded them. You can't really find any complaints, and you can find tons of stories of people appreciating their guns. So instead of walking down a variety of praises, I will share with you just one interesting story that is a little longer, but I think it's just worth telling. This is Arthur Guy MP, an American who volunteered with the British Army. He served as a machine gunner and his team manned a Vickers. One of the boys on my gun claimed that he could play a tune while the gun was actually firing, and demonstrated this fact one day on the target range. We were very enthusiastic and decided to become musicians. After constant practice, I became quite expert in the tune entitled "All Conductors Have Big Feet." Now, I promise I tried to find this melody. I did not have a bit of luck, I'm afraid. If someone actually knows this, please write us in. I'd be happy to toss it up on another episode. Anyway, he goes on to describe being assigned to the front line after all this training, where they must deal with attacks from German machine guns. There was one gun in particular which used to get our goats. It had the exact range of our elephant dugout entrance, and every evening, about the time rations were being brought up, its bullets would knock up the dust on the road. Then one of our crew got a brilliant idea, and we were all enthusiastic to put it to the test. Next day, Fritz opened up as usual. I let him fire away for a while, and then I butted in with my pup 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 pup. I kept this up for quite a while, used 2 whole belts of ammunition. Fritz had stopped firing in order to listen. Then he started in. Sure enough, he had fallen for our game. His gun was trying to imitate mine. This duet went on for 5 days. Fritz was a good pupil and learned rapidly. In fact, he got better than his teacher. I commenced to feeling jealous. When he had completely mastered the tune, he started sweeping the road again, and we clicked it worse than ever. But he signed his death warrant by doing so, because my friendship turned to hate. The originator of the ruse and the other 2 gunners had Fritz's location taped to the minute. They mounted their 2 guns and also gave me the range. The next afternoon was set for the grand finale. Our 3 guns with different elevations had set their fire so arranged that opening up together their bullets would suddenly drop on Fritz like a hailstorm. About 3 the next day, Fritz started pupping that tune. I blew a sharp blast on a whistle. It was the signal agreed upon. We turned loose and Fritz's gun suddenly stopped in the middle of a bar. We had cooked his goose and our ruse had worked. You know, in this instance, I kind of feel sorry for Fritz, but I'm sure he'd claimed a few men of his own in his days on the front with that excellent machine gun of his. So another reminder of the odd camaraderie between enemies in a horrifying mess. I mean, mutual respect, but obviously a need to resolve this issue with the terminal ballistics. Anyway, the British troops loved the Vickers. Yes, like any other machine gun, it took training and care to run properly, but damned if it wasn't reliable, light, and at times awe-inspiring. Now, the presumed inventor, he would rise to Chief of Vickers Ordnance Department and was responsible for improvements in field guns and heavy artillery. He was knighted in 1917 for his services and joined the Vickers Board of Directors in 1919. His gun, well, it served on beyond World War I, through World War II even. It was only declared obsolete in British service in 1968. But the stories after 1918 are best served for another time in another video. Instead, we'll have to work with what we know now, so let's get Mae in here for her opinion on the British Vickers gun in World War I. Alright gang, we have Mae, and unfortunately no gun. This goes back to last year even, and as I recall, that's because of one accursed machine gun that was promised several times over and we finally managed to borrow. That was the MkI. Now that cleared a backlog, but that means that we're relying on old footage because we did a lot of work to get out there and film this thing and then never really had the opportunity to use it. Like, we couldn't talk about the Vickers without talking about the Maxim first. It would
have been very weird if we had tried to talk about something that have to go back in time and be like, okay, no, but let's go back to the beginning for this one. Like,
well, yeah, to explain the mechanism itself, it takes, I mean, you saw, these are huge episodes to get through this stuff. So we got it in order though, but there's some footage missing. We didn't get to play with the tripod. We didn't really film you setting it up or anything, which is something that we're trying to start doing nowadays. And a lot of this is because of experience. And a lot of this is because of support from our viewers who have really made this a much easier show to produce in some ways, where we now have help and time and equipment where we can stop, breathe a little easy and not sweat it and just get the shots that we want to get. But also, we were on a busy range, limited range, lots of people around.
Yeah, we had a lot of pieces available to us that day, and we had a fixed amount of time to get all the footage we wanted to get in. So we really had to make the call on what had to be taken and what had to be left behind.
Now, all this is to say, hopefully we'll just borrow a US Vickers and we'll get it all completely right on the filming, because we're really working on having a show that is much more visual as we go forward. We're just cleaning up the old stuff that we had handy. So, by the way, beautiful friends out there, did you want to give any special thanks on this one? I feel like you had a best buddy.
Yes, Michael. Honestly, dude, you were a big help on range that day. He took some time to kind of take apart the gun with me, show me some extra functionings of it. He, not just that one, but with all the other guns that were there on range that he put his hands on, he was a huge help that day on range. Thanks again, man.
And we have other friends to thank from that day, but we'll get to them here and there. So, let's talk about the Vickers gun, because this is pretty revolutionary. Like, this is a truly modern gun, and a lot of times now that we're late into the series, we talk about old guns dug up for the war that are barely making it, but we get to talk about something very fresh and new, very advanced for the period. Now, how do you feel ergonomically being handed and handling that Vickers gun?
First and foremost, I did want to say this is an absolutely gorgeous piece. I think for me, it is the most beautiful machine gun of the war. And I am saying that, and I've handled a ton of machine guns, more than just what has been seen on the show. People, at this point, I'm kind of becoming a machine gun connoisseur. I feel like that could be a wonderful title for Othais to add, and at the end of the thing, at the credits, just for me. But hey, we'll see what happens in the movie magic later.
I don't think she's going to get the title anytime soon, because she called the Vickers the most attractive machine gun of the war, when we happen to know that there is such a thing called the Parabellum 1913, which looks like basically evil alternate universe version of the Vickers gun. It is Spock's goatee.
It's from the Negasus?
Yeah, no. Anyway, so, other than your terrible taste in machine gun aesthetics, Mae's right. She has handled quite a few guns off camera, and those are coming in future episodes, so you have a little bit of opinion, but the audience only knows about the MkI and the Maxim 1910 right now in terms of emplaced fixed machine guns. We've handled some light machine guns as well. That's a whole other category of arm and how they're used. So with the Maxim as the basis, how would you describe the Vickers?
Comparatively, it is much lighter. I mean, when you think of the Maxim or the 1910 or the MkI, this thing is just insane, just the difference in weight, because it's less than 30 pounds. So when you first pick it up, you think, oh, this one actually had a potential to be developed into a run-and-gun machine gun. It really did, but unfortunately, with that trigger and safety setup, which I'll talk about that in a moment, it really just isn't possible. Unfortunate, but That's reality.
I can't say impossible. It was in the original patent drawings. They had a stock attached to a Vickers. Okay, it's too much weight in the front. We have other real light machine guns to show you in future episodes. But you can theoretically do this. I would not advise it.
I mean, I did shoulder the T-Gewehr that for like about 2 seconds before it eventually, All
right, so you are using this with a tripod, so let's talk about that.
The tripod is a very simplistic setup, and again, unfortunately, sorry guys, we don't have footage of it, but you do just place it in. It's got pin sets in it, and you have a wheel that you can manipulate the gun to go up and down to the rear. It's a very simple tripod, and honestly, it's a little too simple. I feel like they could have probably had something better developed later on, maybe. I don't know, but that Mark IV tripod setup is just, it's dead. It's dead simple, like it really is. No better description for that. The action, that is different than it was for the Maxim. So you're normally used to pushing it away from you for the charging handle and letting it fly. Well, this one, it just turns your whole world upside down. You have to pull the charging handle towards you and let it go. And
how did you ever figure it out? The British War Office was alarmed. They wondered if they could do something about that because it was so confusing. Are you okay?
I'm a little bit startled.
No, seriously. I watched her do it because I didn't warn her. I wanted to see because I had known this thing about flipping it. How long were you confused?
I did go to push it forward just ever so slightly at the first second, and then I went, oh, wait, okay, if it doesn't go forward, it obviously goes back. I mean, come on.
It was less than a second. I mean, it was no delay. She would click, and that was it.
That'd be anybody. That'd be anyone, though, with that.
I've met some people. Anyway, in terms of loading, what do you do here?
For loading, it's pretty much the same as the MG08 and the Maxim. Like you pull the belt through, you charge the handle twice. Again, people in the opposite direction, and you're ready to go. Now for firing, that is a little bit different in that you have to pull the safety up with I just use my index fingers and then depress the trigger in, or the trigger paddles in order to fire. That is a little bit awkward in that, when you're first looking at it, it's not intuitive to understand what you're supposed to do with it. So you do have to take a look at it for a second, just be like, oh no, okay, obviously I've got to pull this up in order to depress that in. It doesn't go any other way. And so at that point, we're getting into firing. Golly, does that still bounce? That was a bit unexpected. I thought maybe it was going to be a little more settled in that tripod, but no, honestly, it's still because it's a toggle lock system, and then on top of that, it is very light, so unfortunately, there's not a lot of mass to hold it in place, and again, that tripod, I feel like it just didn't have enough weight to it, so it wasn't really stabilizing it enough. Again, we could have sandbagged it, maybe that would have made a difference.
Well, to be fair, hold on. If you heavy up the tripod, now your tripod's heavy, somebody's got to carry that.
Yeah, that's true.
You're thinking you're the machine gun carrying guy. But if you're the tripod carrying guy, you don't want a heavier tripod. But she is right. Generally, we're going to get complaints about this, I know, as we get into these machine guns about vibration and stuff like that. We certainly got it with the Maxim where they're like, it seems like it's really working up a kick, an oscillation. And they do. Sustained fire with a machine gun that is not like sandbagged down really starts to rattle. They really start to, you see it left to right, you see it top to bottom. Like, these things really have whatever. It depends on the lock, too. It's odd, but I'm starting to get a flavor of, almost like drawing with a spirograph. Depending on the action of the gun, whether it's piston driven or if it's got, a toggle lock or something, I can kind of guess how our spread's going to shape itself.
But here's the thing. You aren't necessarily going to have sandbag options available to you or have an option to really dig it into any sand or anything like that. Sometimes you're just going to have to plunk it into soft mud and then go.
Yeah, which is why we tend to just plunk it down, kick it in, and use it. Also, it's easier. We don't have to carry sandbags everywhere we go to every shoot. But I also just think it's fair to test it naked. If we had time, if we had ammo, if we had everything that we need, yeah, okay, we could spend multiple days digging it in, putting it in this position, that position. If we had 2 miles of land and FAA clearance, we could shoot into the air,
Basically, guys, our bag of I wish is very big.
Yeah, so keep on with the support because as long as we get the support, we'll just keep going down the wish list. As a matter of fact, as we start to get into some machine guns that we have on hand now, we're going to see a lot more visuals because you guys have supported us. You made it possible. Now, where are we at? Because you have alarmed me. Because we talked about the triggers and the vibration, all this firing stuff, but I don't remember you actually looking at what you were shooting at just yet.
No, I didn't look down. I didn't discuss the sights just yet. So it is an aperture sight setup, which great, fantastic. I'm able to narrow down on what I'm looking at. But the problem is that with that shake and vibration, I'm just losing my sight picture on that one. Now, luckily, I was pretty accurate with it in terms of nailing my target. I really didn't wander off it that much. But the problem is that we were also on a short range that day. So there's really no telling like what it could have done at a longer distance. And unfortunately, again, I wish, my big I wish bag was that, you know, we could have had, you know, several hundred yards essentially to test it on, but that just really wasn't available to us at that day. And at the range we were at, we didn't want to risk potentially going over the berm. So unfortunately, we did have to do a short test with that. And like I said, accurate at short range, but who knows for the long one.
Yeah, now long range ladder style sight, even though it's not a 2-post ladder, it's a flip up rod, and then dial it in, notch, the usual stuff. Can't test any of it. We don't have we don't have a mile long safety range where we can just throw 303 into the air.
There's just no point to testing it or trying to even.
Oh, that'd be a beautiful. I'd love to. I would love to.
Well,
but
we'd love to, but no range.
Yeah, we'd also have to. I mean, could you imagine? Because the margin of error would be within where we put the cameras, so we'd just have to give up on some cameras and hope we didn't hit them.
It'd be worth it.
Oh yeah, it'd be worth it. So when we talk about shooting these guns, a lot of people say, "Well, are you a combat expert? Are you whatever? Are you what?" No, we're historians who are appreciating a firearm that's in front of us, and we're trying to get a feel for it. There is no way to synthesize the experience of using a gun like this in combat, which is why it's always valuable to go back and read the testimonies like we saw earlier with MP. Like that was a beautiful, that was a tragic story in a way, but still wildly interesting. So whenever you get a chance, read. And when you read, you can have a sense of the weight and the sort of handling that goes into these things. But yeah, there's no way to perfectly replicate that. That's not what we're for. We're just here for the exploration itself. So with all that in mind, though, I will ask you to make sort of a vague judgment. I'd like to know if you were a soldier who was destined to man a machine gun, have all the machine guns in the Great War, on the ground specifically in this case, because we haven't started talking about aviation or anything yet, and you were issued a Vickers gun, how confident are you going to feel? How does that make you, I guess, would you put a gamble on your own survival ahead of anything else? Like, is this in your top or lower end of machine guns in the war?
For me, I would realistically put it in the top end, simply because performance-wise, it was beautiful on range. It really didn't give us any problems, and it was probably one of 2 machine guns that the entire day that didn't have any functionality issues. So that was absolutely fantastic. And then it's got a decent cartridge. The sights are pretty good. Like I said, the only complaint that I really have is when it came to the vibration, the fact that it's not the most mobile. But at the very least, if I've got a buddy with me to take my tripod, the gun itself is incredibly light. We can man it together. Yeah, it's something that I would feel very confident with.
Yeah, it's truly modern. Very well designed for the conflict that it was going into. I mean, it wasn't actually designed for World War, but it's one of those things. It's like, let's just improve what we've got. And then it happens to fit so perfectly into the next generation's demands. It is truly natural selection at work in terms of evolution of design, because it's not that they invented the thing to fit the situation, it's that they invented a bunch of things, and this thing of many things was perfect for the emergent situation, and therefore it bred. They built thousands of them because they could strap them to planes, because they could field them on the ground. It could go anywhere where there would be a mounted machine gun, and you didn't sort of give up all those costs associated with weight and, you know, the exhaustion of carrying said weight and all the equipment that goes with it, because it runs with a simple belt instead of some of the other loading systems that we're going to see. Like, it's a very direct machine gun, and you know, it doesn't look out of place in a modern conflict in now. Like, if you saw just war footage of who knows where, and, you know, usually we're seeing what, like Brownings and things like that, and there just happened to be a Vickers. If you were a historian, you'd go, oh, Vickers. But if you weren't, you probably wouldn't notice. It'd be another one of those boxes that's roughly this size and roughly this weight with a belt sticking out of it. It's a modern machine gun. I think it's a very good design. I'd feel very confident with it in this sort of conflict. Now, we know that the attrition rate for machine gunners in general is pretty scary, so not too excited about that. But, you know, you make a lot of noise and a lot of light, people are going to notice. So I guess with all that in mind, we're putting the Vickers very high, right? Like, probably, I mean, at least we've seen like 3 emplaced machine guns so far, but it's definitely the number 1 for now, right?
For now, it is number 1. Although, that being said, I have shot plenty of others, so we'll see where it ends up in the standing towards the end of the game.
Yeah, and if you're watching this because you love the Vickers gun and you happen to own one of the US ones, we would like to borrow one. We'd really like to actually try it in 30-06 with the different sights. There's a whole story there, and we'd love to explore it on this show. All right, so once again, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your support, and we appreciate really every viewer. I want to make sure I spell that out, because if you're here watching something this length, you're here to educate yourself and to share an experience, and we're glad to share it with you. All right, anything that you'd like to cover?
Nope, y'all have a good evening.
All right, bye-bye.
I've been busy as a beer building trenches, but I stopped because I wore away my spade. I've been digging for a fortnight with a mud up to me neck, me clothes all torn and tattered, and I looked a perfect wreck. All at once 1,000 Germans shouted, "Give us meat." I gave them a sausage that I dug up for a treat. So me old iron cross, what a weight I do declare. Over there in Germany, they're giving them away. You can have a dozen if you sound too right. The guys that shouted, "Meat, meat, meat," I gave him some, of course. Though we only had a nibble at me old damn bone, he gave me the old iron cross. I was scouting round a place they called muzzle.